Let's say it together, shall we? It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. This is the very first sentence of my favorite classic novel of all time, Pride and Prejudice. I have many reasons for making this one my favorite, and I will share them all with you today. I know this is going to be quite a long video, so we might as well get into it right away. As always, we start the discussion with a detailed plot summary. Timestamps are listed below as usual should you wish to skip it. So make sure you have your tea or any other beverage of your choice, and let's get started. The story starts at the estate of Longbourn in Hertfordshire, where we meet Mr. and Mrs. Bennett. They are discussing the fact that the neighbouring estate of Netherfield has finally been let by a young gentleman named Mr. Bingley. He's wealthy and he's single, a fact quite relevant to the Bennett family since they have no fewer than 5 unmarried daughters and no sons. Therefore, they had little choice but to find wealthy husbands. And there we have the premise of the story. It sounds simple, but trust me, it's not. So the first plot point is the ball and the local assembly hall. A ball sounds very grand, but it's actually more of a social gathering for the neighbouring families. Nothing too fancy. This is where the Bennett family meet their new neighbour, Mr. Bingley, who arrives at the ball with his 2 sisters, his brother-in-law and his close friend, the tall, handsome and very wealthy Mr. Darcy. Bingley is immediately smitten by Jane Bennett, the eldest Bennett daughter, and he dances with her most of the evening. Mr. Darcy, however, seems reluctant to dance. He is in general the very opposite of his friend. Bingley is lively and social, and Darcy gives a proud and reserved impression. He doesn't want to dance with women he's not already acquainted with, a social no-no in Regency England. So when someone suggests he should ask Elizabeth Bennet to dance, he remarks that she's tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt me. And Elizabeth overhears this. Luckily, Elizabeth isn't hurt by this, but jokingly makes fun of him with her sister Jane after the ball. We get a more detailed introduction to Elizabeth here. She is the second eldest daughter and the main protagonist of the story. Jane Bennet is described as the eldest, and she is also the most beautiful of them all. We learn that these 2 young women are very different in character. Jane is gullible and sweet-tempered, whereas Elizabeth is more cynical. But they are still quite close and share everything with each other. The next plot point happens at another social gathering, this time at the Lucas family home, who are close friends and neighbours to the Bennett family. Bingley is still openly interested in Jane, sparking rumours of a potential match between them. This time, Darcy apparently feels a little bad for slighting Elizabeth at the ball and decides to ask her to dance. But she refuses him, saying she has no inclination to dance that evening. A polite way of saying, no thank you, not with you. Switching POV for a moment, we learn that Mr. Darcy finds himself admiring Elizabeth. The next plot point is that Jane is invited to dine at Netherfield, unfortunately, though not with Mr. Bingley but with his 2 sisters. Mrs. Bennet thinks it a shame that Jane will be going all the way there without seeing Mr. Bingley and decides on a little scheme. She refuses to let Jane have the carriage as it looks like it's going to rain. It was her idea that Jane would have to spend the night there without a carriage to bring her back home. So Jane goes on horseback, and sure enough, it does start raining before Jane even reaches Netherfield. She is soaking wet upon her arrival and develops a cold throughout the evening. Everyone is concerned about Jane, and she gets to stay at Netherfield until she recovers. Elizabeth gets especially worried and decides to go and visit her. When she finds Jane in bed with a fever, Mr. Bingley offers to let Elizabeth stay as well to help look after Jane. So the 2 sisters end up staying there for a few days, and since Jane was mostly sleeping, Elizabeth spent some time with their hosts. including Mr. Darcy. Being a keen observer, she notices how concerned Bingley was for her sister and realizes how he truly cares about her. His sisters, however, seemed a bit more disingenuous. They were very polite and said all the right things, but you could tell that they didn't really mean it. One of the sisters, Caroline Bingley, was evidently quite interested in Mr. Darcy and kept trying to get his attention. He, on the other hand, was more keen on Elizabeth. They always ended up in some intellectual or philosophical discussion, which sparked a bit of jealousy in Miss Bingley. Elizabeth, however, is not charmed by his attentions. She finds his proud reserve very unpleasant and judgmental. During their stay at Netherfield, Mrs. Bennet stops by to check on Jane. She makes a rather dramatic display about Jane being far too ill to be moved, and she goes on to boast about Jane's beauty and even talk back a bit to Mr. Darcy, which causes a great deal of embarrassment for Elizabeth. She could just feel Mr. Darcy's disapproval of her family, and it made her dislike him even more. Once Jane is recovered, she and Elizabeth go back to Longbourn just in time for the next plot point. Their father, Mr. Bennet, has received a letter from a distant cousin of theirs, Mr. Collins. He is the one who will actually inherit the estate when Mr. Bennet dies. As previously mentioned, it had to be inherited by a male heir. So Mr. Collins is a clergyman, recently set up in his own parsonage, and he expresses his wish to come and visit the family to get better acquainted. So yes, Mr. Collins arrives, and he turns out to be quite the character. You would have a difficult time finding someone more dreary, whilst at the same time being so amusing in how ridiculous he is. He doesn't understand social cues and therefore has no idea when someone is making fun of him. Mr. Bennet had a surprisingly fun time with this. Mr. Collins has a wealthy patroness, Lady Katherine. It is a suitable nickname for her, I have to admit. He has a wealthy patroness, Lady Katherine de Bourgh, and his house is situated quite close to her magnificent estate, Rosings Park. He talks about Lady Katherine a lot, and it's clear that he really admires and respects her. So when Lady Katherine suggested to Mr. Collins that he finds himself a suitable wife, he immediately thought of his distant cousin's 5 daughters. At first he expressed interest in Jane as she was the most beautiful of them all, but then Mrs. Bennet indicated that Jane already had an existing attachment to Mr. Bingley. So then he turned his attention towards the second prettiest, Elizabeth. In an attempt to get closer to her, he joins her and her sisters as they walk to the neighbouring village of Meryton to visit their aunt. In the village they make a new acquaintance, a handsome young officer by the name of Mr. Wickham, who has recently joined the regiment currently holding up in Meryton. The 2 youngest Bennet girls, Kitty and Lydia, are very fond of officers, and they find him exceedingly charming. During this meeting, Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy happen to ride by. They all greet each other, and Elizabeth, always the keen observer, sees that Mr. Darcy is unusually cold in his greeting of Mr. Wickham. That evening, at a gathering at their almshouse, the girls get a chance to socialize with Mr. Wickham. Even Elizabeth finds herself a victim of his charming demeanor, and she ends up spending most of the evening in his company. This is when she learns some shocking things. Mr. Wickham told her of his history with the Darcy family, that his own father had been the steward of Mr. Darcy's father before his death, and that Darcy was jealous of his father's affection towards him. When the elder Mr. Darcy died, young Wickham was promised a living in his will. He had intended Mr. Wickham to become a man of the church and have his own parsonage at the Darcy estate. But alas, it was not to be. Mr. Darcy was unwilling to carry out his father's wishes, and thus Mr. Wickham was now forced to make a living as an officer. Elizabeth was horrified. She had already known Darcy to be a proud, elitist sort of man, and she was therefore not at all surprised to hear how awfully he had treated the son of his father's steward. We then get to a key event in the story. A ball is held at Netherfield House, and all the Bennett girls are very excited. Jane hopes to dance with Mr. Bingley, of course. Kitty and Lydia wants to dance with as many officers as they can. Middle child Mary would rather stay home with a book, but is forced to join anyway. And Elizabeth wants to see Wickham again, of course. Maybe even dance with him. But her wishes are soon dampened by Mr. Collins asking for the first 2 dances from her. They arrive at the ball, and Elizabeth soon realizes that Wickham isn't there. Disappointed, she goes on to dance the first 2 dances with Mr. Collins as promised, although she begins to fear what his intentions may be. So she does her best to avoid him, and before she knew it, she was asked to dance by none other than Mr. Darcy, and she accepted him, not really knowing what else to say. Their dance is a bit of an awkward one. Elizabeth tries to make small talk while Darcy is quite reluctant. Eventually, she brings up Mr. Wickham and his unfortunate situation in life, making Darcy even more tense. When the dance is over, Elizabeth talks about it with Jane, who says that Mr. Bingley had told her that Wickham isn't actually a good guy, but Elizabeth isn't convinced. Then, the most embarrassing thing happened. Mr. Collins is seen approaching Mr. Darcy. He's about to talk to him, but they haven't been formally introduced. This is a social faux pas of epic proportions. But the damage is already done. Mr. Collins introduces himself, says that he just found out that Mr. Darcy is none other than the nephew of his patroness, Lady Katherine the Burgh. Imagine the coincidence. He lets Darcy know that his aunt was in excellent health the last time he saw her, but Darcy is anything but pleased at his approach. Elizabeth is mortified. She then had to get even more embarrassed by her mother talking very loudly about how Jane will make a most advantageous match with Bingley. All in all, it was not a very enjoyable evening for Elizabeth. The next day, Elizabeth's worst fear is realized. Back at the Bennett House, Mr. Collins corners her and formally asks her to marry him. She politely refuses him, though. This causes a bit of back and forth where Mr. Collins don't really believe her or don't take her seriously until Mrs. Bennet starts to meddle and tries to convince Elizabeth, where he actually realizes his proposal was indeed unwelcome. A lot of drama ensues and Mr. Collins has to flee the scene. He temporarily goes to the Lucas family, who are close family friends and neighbours to the Bennets. Mrs. Bennet is very upset with Elizabeth, but her father supports her decision. He thinks highly of Elizabeth and could never see her marry such a ridiculous man. The next day, the girls run into Mr. Wickham in Meryton, and Elizabeth learns the reason why he didn't go to the ball was because he wanted to avoid Mr. Darcy. She was very understanding and thought it was really unfair that Wickham had to be the one to stay away despite being the victim in the situation. A bit later, Jane gets a letter from Caroline Bingley with surprising and upsetting news. It turns out that the entire Netherfield party has left Hertfordshire for London and without any plans of ever returning. She writes that the family is eager to spend more time with the Darcy family, in particular Darcy's sister Georgiana, whom Mr. Bingley has always been very fond of. This strongly insinuates that the Bingleys and the Darcys were hoping for a union between them. Jane is heartbroken, but Elizabeth is not fooled. She's convinced that Mr. Darcy has done everything in his power to stop his friend from marrying into her family. Funnily enough, we're not done yet with the shocking news. As it turns out, his brief stay at the Lucas house was apparently enough for Mr. Collins to find himself a new potential wife. he ended up proposing to Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth's best friend, and she accepted him. This meant that once Mr. Bennet dies, the estate of Longbourn would go to them, and all the remaining Bennet girls there would have to move out. So some time passed, and the family continues socializing in Meryton with the officers, especially Mr. Wickham. Elizabeth continues to find him very charming, and so does everyone else. Christmas has now arrived, and the Bennets are visited by their relatives, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. Somewhere around this time, Mr. Wickham finds himself a new love interest, a young woman who's just inherited £10,000. Elizabeth isn't upset by this, as she is well aware that Mr. Wickham has to marry someone with money, as he doesn't have any himself. Kind of the same situation as she's in. She finds it frustrating, though, that the reason for this is all because of Mr. Darcy. As Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner live in London, Elizabeth suggests that Jane go back there with them after the holidays to get a break from Hertfordshire. Jane agrees, and it's settled. The next couple of months are quite uneventful at Longbourn, but as we go into spring, it is finally time for Elizabeth to visit Charlotte at her new home in Hunsford, where she now lives as Mrs. Collins. So she goes there with Charlotte's father, Sir Lucas, and her younger sister, Maria. The two friends have a happy reunion, and Elizabeth was pleasantly surprised at how content Charlotte seemed to be, despite her choice in a husband. Now, a visit at the Collinses would not be complete without seeing Mr. Collins' patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and the party is soon invited to dine at her manor, Rosings Park. Elizabeth's impression of Lady Catherine is that she is a very headstrong and entitled woman, and Lady Catherine herself was shocked at Elizabeth being so outspoken for her age. A couple of weeks pass quite comfortably, and Elizabeth and the others are often invited to Lady Catherine during this time. Soon enough, the old lady gets some other visitors, Mr. Darcy and his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam. As you can imagine, Elizabeth is anything but pleased at seeing Mr. Darcy again. At Easter, they are all invited for dinner at Rosings Park, and Elizabeth is told by Lady Catherine to play the piano. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam go over to see her as she plays, and they start having a conversation. Elizabeth then mentions hers and Darcy's first meeting at the Assembly Hall ball, where he wouldn't dance despite there being many young women without a partner. Darcy admits that this is a flaw of his, that he's not very good at conversing with strangers. Elizabeth then makes a point that she's not very good at playing the piano, because she didn't make the trouble of practicing. Shortly after this dinner, Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam would make frequent visits at the parsonage. During these visits, Mr. Darcy would watch Elizabeth a lot and say very little, causing Charlotte to think he has some kind of crush on Elizabeth. One day, Darcy stops by the parsonage by himself when Elizabeth is alone there. They exchange some awkward niceties before Darcy finally reveals his true motives for coming there, and he says, and I quote, "In vain I have struggled, it will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you." As romantic as this declaration sounds, what follows is quite the opposite. He explains that he loves her despite her inferiority, and Elizabeth finds this really insulting. With good reason. So they end up having a bit of an argument where Elizabeth brings up both the Jane and Bingley situation as well as the whole Wickham thing. Darcy seems shocked at this reaction from her. He seems to have taken for granted that she would accept him. And in her anger, Elizabeth finishes her refusal by saying he was the last man in the world whom she could ever be prevailed on to marry. So Darcy has to flee the scene, tail between his legs, leaving Elizabeth sobbing from pure rage. The next day, however, she runs into him during one of her walks through the grounds. He hands her a letter and immediately leaves her alone. Overcome with curiosity, Elizabeth reads the letter, and she finds its contents to be both distressing and illuminating. He writes about the Jane and Bingley situation, how he hadn't perceived any true affection from her sister towards Bingley, and therefore thought it was his duty to prevent his friend from making a mistake. He then addressed his relationship with Mr. Wickham and revealed that he was indeed supposed to have a living once he had become ordained, but Wickham had declined it and asked for a sum of money instead, as he intended to study the law. Darcy had given it to him and hoped that would be the end of it. But after a couple of years, Wickham wrote to him again, changing his mind. He was in a bad state financially and now wanted to be ordained so that he could have that living, but Darcy refused this and every other repeated request of it. Wickham had then decided on another, far less honourable approach. He had gone after Darcy's little sister, Georgiana, who was staying at a country house over the summer. He went there and charmed her, basically, until he had her consent to an elopement. She was a 15-year-old girl with an inherited fortune of £30,000, an incredibly large amount of money. Luckily, Mr. Darcy had gone up there for a surprise visit and managed to put a stop to it. Reading this letter was highly distressing for Elizabeth. She was still very angry at him for his role in her sister's heartbreak, but as for the account of Wickham, she was shocked and appalled. She had no reason to doubt this being true, as it was very shameful to have a family member elope back in those days, and it wouldn't be very common to admit this to just anyone. Overall, she was very conflicted. And it's finally time to leave Hunsford and go back to Hertfordshire with a quick detour through London on the way to pick up Jane. Once back home, they learn that the regiment staying in Meryton will be leaving in a fortnight. And Elizabeth is relieved that Wickham will be out of their lives when they do. Because of this, she decides not to expose him to the rest of their society, sparing Mr. Darcy and his sister the shame of everyone knowing what almost happened. As the regiment is leaving for Brighton, the youngest Bennett sister, Lydia, is invited to join them, as she has become close friends with the young wife of a colonel. Elizabeth thinks this is a terrible idea, but Mr. Bennett says she's far too poor to be of interest to any fortune hunters. And so, when the regiment leaves for Brighton, Lydia goes with them. It is now summer, and Elizabeth has made plans to go on a trip with her aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. As a last-minute change of plans, the Gardiners decided they would go to Derbyshire. Elizabeth was apprehensive, as Derbyshire happened to be the home county of Mr. Darcy. But it's summer, he couldn't possibly be home, right? So off they go, and they arrive at the inn of a village called Lambton. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner expressed their desire to see the grand estate of Pemberley, the house of the Darcy family, and so Elizabeth asks a servant at the inn whether the Darcys are home or not. They find out that they are not home and that the house is open for visitors, so it's decided. When they arrive, Elizabeth is very impressed by the grounds and the manor. Her imagination is running wild. Of this I might have been mistress, she thought. She would have invited her aunt and uncle there as guests. Oh, but no, that's right, she reminds herself that Darcy didn't approve of her family. They are given a guided tour of the house by the housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, who speaks highly of her master, Mr. Darcy. When Elizabeth sees a large portrait of him, she realizes her feelings towards him are changing. As they are about to leave, who should pop up but the master of the house himself? Having just arrived home, Mr. Darcy greets them somewhat awkwardly. Elizabeth is mortified. What will he think of her now, showing up at his house like this? He gets over the awkwardness, however, and joins them for a walk through the grounds. He tells Elizabeth that Mr. Bingley and his sisters will be there next day, as well as his own sister, Georgiana. He asks if he might introduce Elizabeth to her, to which she is very touched. So the next day, Darcy, Bingley and Georgiana stops by the inn at Lambton, and Elizabeth observes them closely. Contrary to what Caroline Bingley had said in her letter to Jane, there seems to be no attachment at all between Bingley and Georgiana. Elizabeth's feelings are changing rapidly now. What had formerly been a severe dislike had been replaced by esteem, respect, and even gratitude. So the following day, Elizabeth and the Gardiners are invited to dine at Pemberley. Caroline Bingley is there as well now, being her usual jealous self. She observed Elizabeth and Darcy as if to detect if anything was going on between them. And she made some rude remarks to try and throw Elizabeth off guard. Back at the inn the next day, Elizabeth gets a couple of delayed letters from Jane, and so the Gardiners go for a walk by themselves so that she can read them. The contents of these letters are highly upsetting. They tell of Lydia, their sister, having eloped from the regimental camp at Brighton with none other than Mr. Wickham. Because of course she has. The worst part of it all is that they haven't actually married, so it's a huge scandal. Elizabeth gets really upset as she reads this, and just at that moment, Mr. Darcy stops by for a visit. He sees how distressed she is and asks what happened, and she tells him everything. He looks very grave, and Elizabeth suspects that he wouldn't want anything more to do with her now. Her family's reputation is completely ruined by Lydia's actions. He's very polite, however, and excuses himself to let her deal with this obviously private matter without his intrusion. So Elizabeth and the Gardiners set off to get back to Hertfordshire immediately. The word was that Lydia and Wickham were holding up somewhere in London, and Mr. Bennett and Mr. Gardiner go there to try and find them. Meanwhile, the Bennett House is in turmoil. Mrs. Bennet is inconsolable. She stays in her room all day long, wailing about how Mr. Bennet will have to fight Wickham in a duel, and when he dies, they will all be thrown out by Mr. Collins. Having no success in London, Mr. Bennet returns home. After a little while, Mr. Gardiner sends a letter saying he's finally seen Lydia and Wickham and has persuaded him to marry her on the condition that they get £100 a year as well as an additional £50 upon her parents' death. Mr. Bennet is sure Wickham would never have agreed to so little, and therefore wonders how much money Mr. Gardiner had to put out to make him agree to it. As soon as Mrs. Bennet hears the news, she immediately forgets her distress and is overjoyed at finally having one of their daughters married. Elizabeth regrets having told Darcy of Lydia's elopement, thinking that the scandal might have been concealed from him. She thought of him with grief, feeling certain that he would never want to see her again, especially with Wickham as her brother-in-law. Lydia and Wickham are quickly married in London in a private ceremony, and immediately afterwards they left for Hertfordshire. Seeing her family again, Lydia was her normal, unapologetic self, and in her eagerness to talk about the wedding, she mentions Mr. Darcy being there. But that was a slip-up. She wasn't supposed to say anything about that. Elizabeth had to know, so she wrote to her aunt, Mrs. Gardiner, asking for the details. The reply she gets explains everything. How it was Darcy who had found Lydia and Wickham through his own connections, how he had been the one to persuade Wickham to marry her, despite this never having been his intent. He had then gone on to settle Wickham's financial debts and made Mr. Gardiner take the credit for it, as he didn't want his own involvement to be known. Elizabeth read and reread the letter, and as she did so, she couldn't help but feel that he had done it for her. Mr. Wickham and Lydia leave towards their new home in the north, and the only one really sad about them leaving is Mrs. Bennet. Just as things were going back to normal, they hear the news that Mr. Bingley is to return to Netherfield for a shoot. Jane is clearly affected by this and is very nervous about his impending arrival. On the third day of him being back, the Bennet girls see him approach their house, and he has Mr. Darcy with him. Everyone is very excited, and Mrs. Bennet is extremely polite to him, whilst at the same time being outwardly rude towards Mr. Darcy, making Elizabeth feel embarrassed as always. Both Bingley and Darcy stop by for more visits over the following days, and Bingley even came on his own to socialize with the family or to do some shooting with Mr. Bennet. During these visits, Mrs. Bennet does everything in her power to get Bingley and Jane alone together, until eventually all their hopes are confirmed. He asked her to marry him, and she accepted him. Bingley was from then on a daily visitor at Longbourn, arriving after breakfast and staying until after supper. Mrs. Bennet was overjoyed. She had all but forgotten Lydia, and Jane was now her new favourite. About a week after their engagement, an unexpected visitor arrives at Longbourn. It is none other than Lady Katherine de Bourgh, and she asks to have a private chat with Elizabeth. She makes her reason for coming very clear. She has heard a rumour that her nephew, Mr. Darcy, and Elizabeth are engaged. She demands to know if this is true and adds that it couldn't be, since Darcy has been promised to Lady Catherine's daughter since childhood. Elizabeth avoids the question, but must eventually admit that no, they are not in fact engaged. Lady Catherine then asks her to promise never to accept a proposal from him, but this she could not do. She refuses, thus making Catherine incredibly angry, and she storms out of there again. After a brief stay in London, Darcy comes back to Longbourn for another visit. He and Bingley go for a walk with Jane and Elizabeth, and soon enough Elizabeth and Darcy are finally walking on their own. She starts by thanking him for his help in the whole Lydia and Wickham situation, and he confirms her suspicions that it was indeed his regard for her that made him do it. He then asks her whether her feelings are the same as they were before, because his feelings are unchanged. Elizabeth admits that her feelings are very different now. He goes on to tell her about his aunt, Lady Catherine, and her having told him everything about her visit to Longbourn, and what Elizabeth had said to her. It had the opposite effect on him than she had intended. It had made him hopeful. They go on to talk openly about many things, such as his letter and how Elizabeth's feelings for him had begun to change, how her refusal of his first proposal had humbled him and made him want to better himself. All of this could naturally only have one conclusion. They finally got engaged. Then, of course, we get all the announcements, some letters had to be written, and everyone's reactions to their engagement. For the first time throughout the entire book, Mrs. Bennet was actually speechless. Then we do a bit of fast-forwarding, and we learn of what happened after the weddings. Elizabeth, of course, moved to Pemberley and quickly formed a sisterly bond with Georgiana. Jane and Bingley remained at Netherfield for a year, but it turned out to be too close to Mrs. Bennet for their liking, and they soon moved to an estate closer to Elizabeth and Darcy. With the exception of Mr. Wickham, all of Elizabeth's family were frequent visitors at Pemberley, and even though it's not specifically said in the book, it is highly implied that they all lived happily ever after. Jane Austen was an excellent observer of human behavior and psyche, which makes analyzing her characters a real treat. It becomes clear how much work she's put into creating them, adding small details here and there that might not be super relevant to the overall plot, but makes so much more sense when brought together as a whole. Every single thing that a character says and does will always reflect their personality in both obvious and subtle ways, and I'll give some examples of that as we go through the list of characters and their relationships. Let's start with Mr. and Mrs. Bennett. The dynamic between Mr. and Mrs. Bennett is as tragic as it is amusing. Mrs. Bennett is too narrow-minded to form any deeper connections, and yet too emotional not to meddle in everything she possibly can. In other words, she's a gossip, she's an overbearing mother, and a drama queen, essentially. And I love her. I think she is by far the funniest character in the entire book. And then we have her husband. Mr. Bennett is a calm, quiet gentleman who prefers spending his days alone in his library. While Mrs. Bennett will make sure to be invited to every single social event in the area, Mr. Bennett will try to stay away from as many as possible. When he speaks, he usually takes on a subtle and sarcastic tone, which his wife doesn't understand, and this ends up being his one source of amusement from her. He takes weeks to reply to a single letter, which to me speaks volumes about his character. Being an introvert myself, I can take forever to reply to a message as well, because I tend to overthink my phrasing and I end up rewriting it several times to make sure that I can't be misunderstood. I suppose that's why I love his character so much. I feel like I can understand him in a way. So bringing these two people together, we get a relationship that is unsatisfactory to both parties. So they both shift their focus onto other things. He on his books and solitude, she on getting her daughters married. They become extreme versions of themselves, and in my view, this is because of their lack of intimacy and connection with their partner in life. That is the tragic part of their dynamic. The way I see it, it would be impossible for Mr. and Mrs. Bennett to express themselves in a way that would make them understand one another. He will always be above her in intellect, which makes his conversation uninteresting to her, and she will always be too emotional and to some degree irrational for him to ever take her seriously. A good example of this can be seen quite early in the book, as early as on page 3, in fact, when Mrs. Bennet tells her husband of Mr. Bingley moving into the neighborhood and her hopes of him falling in love with one of the girls. She is annoyed with Mr. Bennet here as he doesn't want to go and visit Bingley. "They have none of them much to recommend them," replied he. "They are all silly and ignorant like other girls, but Lizzie has something more of quickness than her sisters." "Mr. Bennet, how can you abuse your own children in such a way? You take delight in vexing me. You have no compassion on my poor nerves." "You mistake me, my dear. I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have heard you mention them with consideration these 20 years at least." You do not know what I suffer. But I hope you will get over it and live to see many young men of 4,000 a year come into the neighborhood. It will be no use to us if 20 such should come, since you will not visit them. Depend upon it, my dear, that when there are 20, I will visit them all. As we can see in this exchange, Mr. Bennet is quite sarcastic in the way he interacts with his wife, and she uses her emotional state in her attempts to communicate. There are many more examples of this, but I think I've made my point. Jane and Bingley are so sweet. That is the word that comes to mind when trying to describe their dynamic. Now, we don't get as much exposure with these two, as their romance happens a bit on the sideline when the reader is focused on Elizabeth and Darcy. But this doesn't mean that they aren't as well developed. If we look at Jane, at first glance we see a seemingly flawless character. She is uncommonly beautiful, kind, and sweet-tempered. But a closer inspection will show a woman who's actually really insecure. So when she and Bingley start to socialize, she is afraid to show her interest openly. The only one who can see it is Elizabeth, because she knows her sister better than anyone. But to other people around them, she comes across as a bit cold compared to Bingley's love-struck behavior. He makes it no secret how much he likes her, and perhaps this made her even more insecure because she found herself unable to match his intensity. That is only me speculating. It was never confirmed in the book. But what is confirmed is that Darcy did not perceive Jane's affection towards Bingley. And he wasn't the only one. Elizabeth knew Jane to be shy, and Charlotte Lucas, before she became Mrs. Collins, even mentioned to Elizabeth that Jane had to step it up if she was to secure Bingley. Now, if we take a closer look at him, on the other hand, we see a lively, sociable, and optimistic young man. As we learn from Darcy's letter to Elizabeth, Bingley had fallen in love before. Quite often, in fact. So we know he's a bit of a romantic. But as he began spending more time with Jane, it became evident to Darcy that he preferred her over any other woman he'd ever met. Like he was in love for real this time. This was a problem, since Jane did not look as if she loved him back. And as Bingley was a wealthy man prone to fall in love, he was an easy target for gold diggers. And Jane did not have any money herself and no inheritance waiting for her either. Keeping this in mind, we begin to understand why Darcy encouraged Bingley to leave Netherfield for London. But why did Bingley leave? If his love for Jane was real, why didn't he stay and fight for it? It's easy to think of him as weak-minded if he can be controlled like that by the people who are close to him. And I think this ties into a flaw of his, that he is actually quite gullible. And this is a trait he shares with Jane. They are both a bit naive and tend to believe what people tell them. So Bingley believed Darcy when he said Jane wasn't in love with him, and Jane believed Bingley didn't care for her when his sister Caroline sent the letter about them leaving. In the end, them being so gullible is a big part in why their romance wasn't as straightforward. Although, to be fair, no romances are straightforward in Jane Austen's novels. Which brings me to the arguably most intriguing one. I can't talk about these two without mentioning the one thing staring us in the face. The title of the book. Pride and Prejudice is of course referring to the main couple of the story. Darcy is Pride and Elizabeth is Prejudice. Darcy's privileged background has nurtured this side of him until it went as far as making any new acquaintances find him a bit unpleasant. Elizabeth had more humble beginnings, but she is very opinionated and never met any resistance when it came to forming and expressing those opinions. Her father favored her amongst all her sisters, and her mother, being quite unrefined herself, never made it a priority to keep Elizabeth's views in check. So when she meets Mr. Darcy and overhears him insulting her appearance, she might not be hurt by this comment, but she immediately judges him for it. This negative first impression forms the basis of all her opinions of him for about the first half of the book. The very nature of prejudice is that we tend to look for evidence that supports our preconceptions, and Elizabeth does this all the time. This is why she immediately notices Darcy's disapproval of her family. She looks for reactions from him that shows this. It's also why she was so quick to believe Wickham when he told her about, the false accounts of his dealings with Darcy. She's a smart girl, but she didn't see the warning signs because they didn't fit that viewpoint she so firmly held. This is why it was so unpleasant for her to read Darcy's letter, because it forced her to consider the possibility of her being wrong. And no one likes to admit they were wrong. So it's only after this letter that Elizabeth begins to see the errors in her judgment. And she's embarrassed about how openly she had previously expressed her opinions of him, and thereby letting everyone around her know her viewpoint, which was, in essence, severely misinformed. This insight becomes a lesson to her not to form opinions of people so quickly. So she comes out of this having grown as a person. Now, Darcy had a lesson of his own to learn, and in his case it was probably a bit harder. Pride is a very sensitive thing, and having your pride wounded like that can be a bit jarring. In Darcy's case, he had to be rejected by a woman he was madly in love with. This became the trigger that made him want to change and improve himself. As he himself told Elizabeth at the end of the book, "By you I was properly humbled. I came to you without a doubt of my reception. You showed me how insufficient were all my pretensions to please a woman worthy of being pleased." So he went on. At first he was angry and bitter, as I think anyone would be. But he soon got the chance to show Elizabeth that there was more to him than that. When he ran into her at his own house that summer, he seized the opportunity to be charming and overtly hospitable towards her and Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. By doing so, he challenged her negative views of him, which forced her to see him in a different light. This love story is quite deep, and not just because of the personal obstacles that Elizabeth and Darcy had to overcome in order to unite, but also in the way that they complement each other after their love had been openly declared. We all know the saying, opposites attract, and there is a lot of truth behind this, and although not because it's inherently a good thing to be different, but rather how important it is to learn from each other in order to grow as a couple and as individuals. Elizabeth is a very lively creature. She is energetic in everything she does, from her movement to her speech to her thoughts. She is an active person who prefers long walks in nature over any stationary occupations, such as practicing music, for example. Darcy, on the other hand, is very reserved. He is educated and intelligent, but it's not easy for him to socialize beyond what is expected from social etiquette. He is also quite stuck up, in a sense. And it's because of this that Elizabeth's lively influence is so good for him. This is not just one-sided, of course, as she has things to learn from him as well. As I said before, Elizabeth is a smart girl, but she is quite uneducated and a bit unrefined. And she mentions how beneficial her relationship with Darcy can be for her personal and intellectual growth. So to sum this up, Elizabeth and Darcy have a mutual respect and admiration because of their differences and what they can learn from each other. I think this is why reading their interactions is so satisfying. It is a more modern dynamic, and I think that is why modern audiences still love reading their romance over 200 years later. It's hardly surprising that they are widely considered to be among the favorite fictional couples throughout history. Oh, Mr. Collins. Poor Mr. Collins. I know you're not supposed to like him, but I have to admit, I have a soft spot for this character. He's always making a fool of himself in one way or another, and he doesn't even know it, which makes it rather sad. I think it's safe to say that Collins had no real affection towards Elizabeth. The way he viewed love and marriage was very pragmatic. He needed a wife, that much was certain. He needed her to be of fairly humble origins and to have a good sense of duty. And that was pretty much it. He did not much care about his potential wife's love for him either. As long as she would make him happy, then it's a win. Like when Elizabeth turned down his proposal, Mrs. Bennet excuses her daughter's behavior, saying she can be a bit headstrong, but she'll make her see reason. But this made Collins a bit uncomfortable, and not because he didn't want her to marry him against her will, but rather, if she has such defects of temper, as he called it, she could not possibly contribute much to his happiness after all. So his match with Charlotte is one of pure desperation, on both sides, I would say. Charlotte is 27 years old, and back in those days, that was practically middle age. She would have given up on ever getting married at that point. So when Collins comes to their house, she sees her chance and she pays him a bit of extra attention. And it works. He notices her and appreciates her, and that is enough to make him think that they would be a good match. And they kind of are. When Elizabeth goes to Hunsford to visit them, she sees that Charlotte seems content with her situation. Although as a reader, you get the feeling that even Charlotte finds Mr. Collins ridiculous at times. And to be honest, it would be impossible not to. Lady Catherine de Bourgh is definitely a bit of a villain, and I say this not because of her function in the story. She isn't set up as the main obstacle for Darcy and Elizabeth, but she is without doubt an antagonist. Her personality and the way that she acts is the perfect recipe for intrigue. She is entitled and proud, traits that go hand in hand with her wealth and influence. On top of this, she's also meddlesome. She wants a say in everything and can't stand being left out of any conversation. Her being proud and entitled is something she shares with her nephew, Mr. Darcy. The difference between them, however, is that Darcy experiences something which brings him down from his pedestal, meaning Elizabeth rejecting him. Lady Catherine has never experienced rejection. She has never experienced any obstacles, really, and it shows in the way she treats the people around her. She expects them to indulge and obey her in everything. This is why I love her interactions with Elizabeth. While Elizabeth is brought up as a gentleman's daughter, her father has always been proud of her intellect and her ability to express herself in conversation. This doesn't really fit with Lady Catherine's worldview. She is of the opinion that any young woman should just shut up and do as they're told by their elders. So when Lady Catherine confronts Elizabeth at Longbourn about her and Darcy's alleged relationship, it is no surprise that Elizabeth defends herself, because in her mind, she has the right to do so. I love how clever Jane Austen was in constructing this, because let's say we switch places here between Elizabeth and Jane, then we would have a completely different outcome. Jane would never have talked back to Lady Catherine, no matter how condescending she was, because that's not who she is, nor how she was raised. She was never given the same attention by their father as Elizabeth was, so she never developed this opinionated side that her sister had. All in all, Lady Catherine is the perfect addition to the story as Darcy's disapproving relative, as she brings out that feisty, opinionated side of Elizabeth that makes her so appealing to us as readers. She also serves as a kind of reminder, at least for me, of a possible future for Mr. Darcy. The way I see it, he might have ended up just like her had he decided never to pursue Elizabeth. Caroline Bingley is a Regency England version of a mean girl. She is scheming, she thinks herself superior, she applies this fake persona that is really unpleasant. I would definitely describe her as an antagonist, as she did play a part in removing her brother from Jane. and not to mention her rivalry with Elizabeth in regards to Mr. Darcy. It's clear early on that Caroline Bingley disapproves of Elizabeth and Jane. Their family isn't as wealthy as hers, and that is reason enough not to want to socialize with them. But it doesn't take long for Caroline to get even more reasons to dislike them. Already at their second meeting at the social gathering at Lucas Lodge, Mr. Darcy asks Elizabeth to dance, and she turns him down. After this exchange, he expressed admiration for her fine eyes to Caroline. And Caroline reacts just like any jealous rival would do. She makes jokes about Mr. Darcy marrying Elizabeth and congratulates him on gaining such a fine mother-in-law. She continues using this tactic every time she senses Darcy and Elizabeth having a connection. She is more subtle about it in Elizabeth's presence, of course, but as soon as she has Darcy to herself, she highlights the things that are odd or negative about Elizabeth, as if to remind him that yes, she's pretty, but don't forget she has an overbearing mother and she's poor and she's so weird, etc., etc. Naturally, it doesn't work, as Darcy's feelings for Elizabeth would develop with or without Caroline's interference. And I think she realized this as well when they were all dining at Pemberley together. And this is actually never confirmed in the book, but I think it's obvious that it was Caroline who spread the rumour that led to Lady Catherine confronting Elizabeth. She would already know that Darcy had been promised to his cousin Anne de Bourgh, and perhaps this was some small-minded retaliation on her part. However, that's just me speculating. Lydia and Wickham are without doubt the most tragic of all the couples. They represent that harsh reality of the past where you were stuck in your decisions, regardless of how young you were when you made those decisions. Lydia was 15 or 16. I can't remember if she had turned 16 yet when they eloped, but regardless, that is extremely young to be making such important life choices. She was an impressionable, naive teenager who was seduced by a man at least 10 years her senior. The fact that he never intended to marry her shows his true character, that he was more than willing to ruin this poor girl just to serve his own selfish needs. One could argue that him going after Lydia specifically might have been some kind of revenge. If he was aware of Darcy's and Elizabeth's acquaintance, then he could have seen a possible attachment there and decided to ruin things for them by making a scandal. But I honestly don't think so. I think it was Lydia being Lydia that made this happen. Throughout the book, she is uncommonly extravagant for being poor, and she loves male attention. And one could say that she is as deep as a bowl of soup. All of this, I think, made her an easy and willing target. But that doesn't make it any less wrong, of course. Truthfully, Wickham was an abuser, and I find it disturbing that Lydia had to spend the rest of her life with him as a kind of penance for that one mistake she made in her teens. She was stuck with this horrible man who gambled away all their money, made enemies everywhere they went, and didn't care one bit about her. Yes, her fate was indeed awfully tragic. What a happy note to end this discussion on. There is, of course, so much more one could say about this masterpiece, but this video can't go on forever. Do let me know in the comments below what you think of Pride and Prejudice. Do you agree with my views, or do you think it's overrated? Don't be afraid to voice your opinion, as I would honestly love to know. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to make my day, then consider giving me a comment, a thumbs up, and subscribe. Thank you again, and I hope to see you back next time.